for some people in the room, we need to have a bit of a discussion, as we've done previously. Again, nothing personal, but we need to discuss whether or not this is the right course for you. And if it's not, that's fine. Let's get the paperwork done sooner rather than later. In the case of some blokes, we need to have a little bit more serious conversation, because in my opinion, I don't think you had a serious attempt at the exam, in which case I have no choice but to start sending home HSC warning letters, which is a discussion we need to have in private. But for those blokes who are in that position, we just need to catch up at the end of the period, and you'll know who you are. The reality of exams, but isn't so much for Year 11. The purpose of this, it's nice to get ranks and it's nice to get marks in the prelim course, but ultimately it's not going to change your life. Really what this is about is making sure that in September next year, you can produce the best work possible. It's no mistake that you were given 4 extended response questions, because over the last 5 years, the worst examination component for us in the HSC has been extended response. As a generalisation, guys don't write well. And it's been an area of focus, and we saw in the last assessment task when we did this feedback session, the reason why we're doing it. The HSC results last year and the year before are showing dramatic improvements because we're spending and investing a lot of time in assessment and class time on how to write well for extended response. So really that's the aim of this afternoon. I want you to go to one of the back covers of one of your exam answer books and have your pen in hand. I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Go and get a pen. I'm going to go and ask you a series of questions, and I want you to answer them by yourself, and I want you to answer them honestly. These answers are for you, you alone, not for the bloke next to you, not for discussion. For some people, so some of the questions. When you started preparing for this assessment task, we've got these banners up around the school that are lovely and they look pretty and they're nice to point at, and Mr. Taylor and Compton love pointing at them and talking about them for extended periods at assemblies. But I wonder, have you ever really thought about them in terms of exams? So for this task, I want you to write down a mark out of 10 for each question. So question 1, did you work with friends to develop and proof drafts? Give yourself a mark out of 10 for question 1. You need to process it mentally. Did you work with friends to develop and proofread practice tasks? Question 2, did you work with your teachers to do the same? So question 1 out of 10, mark out of 10, 0 if you did nothing, 10 if you did really well. Did you work with mates? Question 2, did you work with teachers? Give yourself a mark out of 10 for each. Question 3, did you write a plan prior to walking in the exam room? Did you write a plan for each of the 2 questions you were going to attempt, or 3 questions in the case of 2 unit? Did you write a plan? Give yourself a mark out of 10 for question 3. Did you write full answers to those plans prior to walking in the exam room? Give yourself a mark out of 10. We're up to question 5. Did you redraft after consulting with others? So did you just do one version, or did you rework it and try and improve it? I want to go up to question 6. Did you research? Did you have enough support material walking in the exam room? So far you've got a mark out of 60. Question 7. Did you invest the time? Did you put the time into this assessment task in preparation that you needed to? You should now have a mark out of 70. I wonder, add it up, out of 70, when we look at those 3 questions, did you work together? Did you do the hard work? Did you make the sacrifices? Like they're 3 nice banners in the hall, but did you actually do them for this task? My gut feeling is that if you scored a mark above 50, you probably did most of them, and hopefully you scored a mark somewhere in the 80 to 90% range. My genuine hope is that if you scored in the 30s or less, you scored about that percentage as well. So if you scored about 30 out of 70, I hope you scored about 30% or less. And that would be my intention in terms of assessment. My aim isn't to get everyone nicely at 60, it's to get some people at near zero, and it's to get some people at near 100, and spread everyone else out in between. Because that's going to help us when we get to assessment time. For me, if you're looking at each question marked out of 15, I hope that the marking scheme that's there reflects the marks that you got on your piece of paper. Take a look at the two questions, see whether or not for those two questions that marking scheme worked. I made a point with the last assessment task of celebrating you guys publicly and saying these guys did the most amount of work they've ever done for an assessment task and they got the best results they've ever scored. I wonder this time around when I didn't force you by doing marks beforehand, when I didn't force you to do the work, did you? And it's a rhetorical question. It's one for yourself to answer. And maybe it's one for discussion when we get to parent-teacher night in a few weeks. All right, papers down for me. So let's talk through the hard results. And we'll come back to each of the papers, so just leave them on the floor for the moment. How many people walked up here with that question on their mind? Raise your hand. Did I pass? Who was happy they passed? Who was disappointed they didn't pass? All right. Can I suggest to you that the magic number of 50% is a bit of a furphy? I'd suggest to you that you wouldn't be happy with a whole range of occupations if they got it right half the time. I'd suggest to you that you wouldn't be happy if your GP took a random guess and got it right half the time. Same with a pilot. Maybe inappropriate given the last month or two, but you get the idea. I'd suggest to you that the guy who made the roller coaster got about 50%. And my point is this, 50% is no longer good enough. The Board of Studies says that the average is 75%. And so if you're scoring just above 50%, you're well below average. If you're scoring just above 50%, you're well below average. If you're scoring below 75%, you are kidding yourself for an ATAR that's worth much. ATAR and HSC are different, we know that. But if you're genuine about scoring an ATAR that's going to get you anywhere, 75% doesn't cut it. Because most people score 75% or about. If you're talking about university, you want to be in the top third. Here's the big numbers that you always look toward. So average, maximum, minimum. You can see there's a difference between 2 unit and 1 unit, and you'd expect that. Exactly the same questions, and you'll find that in the HSC too. Exactly the same questions in the HSC exam, marked in the same way. So we shuffled up the 1 and 2 unit papers, didn't care which course you came from, and each of the teachers marked a different component. When we then break them apart then, it happens that 2 unit guys did better across the board. What's interesting is that if we were to look at the averages and then look at the minimum column, my expectation would be a few blokes that scored in the minimum range, not just the person who scored nothing, but the couple of people above him, will probably change to Catholic Studies. Right? And that would be my recommendation to them. What that's going to do to the average in 1 unit is shoot that up pretty significantly, and it will go toward the 60 mark. So by taking out a couple of very low-lying marks, like the outriders, you'll find the average jumps pretty well. What's interesting is that 1 unit students achieved higher than 2 unit students. And that's not uncommon either. It happened in Year 12, if I'm not mistaken, as well in their last exam. The challenge for 2 unit blokes, of course, is that when you get to the HSC, you're there for 3 hours. You're writing for 3 hours. You're preparing for 2 extended responses in the HSC, compared to the 1 unit blokes who have only got to do 1 extended response, and you're going to be marked in exactly the same way. So there's a real challenge for 2 unit blokes to be able to sustain the work and to be able to write multiple extended responses when we get there. Just to give you the the versions again, if you like, in a different layout. So the blue column is the raw mark, so you can see the difference, and the percentages in yellow. Interestingly enough, when we break it down by question, so question 1, 2, 3, 4, the blue line is the 2-unit course, the yellow line is the 1-unit course. So there was no question where 1-unit students on average outperformed 2-unit, but there was a difference in the difficulty of the questions, or how well they were responded to at least. So you'll see that across those marks. So for those guys who chose question 2, generally speaking, you didn't do as well. And we'll talk to why later. The reality, again, when we get to the end of year exam, so the semester 2 exam as well as the HSC, is you don't get choice of questions, you don't get to pre-see them. So you could walk into the exam room and run into question 2 from the paper. So certainly what will happen in my class next week or this week will be, we'll do the feedback today. I'll give you an opportunity to review that feedback in one period, and you'll be sitting down and doing a question of my choice in another period. So you may well get question 2, and I'll expect you to be able to sit down and write for 30 minutes and just attack it and do it.
Okay, account for the underground nature of the early Christian church. What I will start by asking is whether you knew before you went into the exam what you were being asked to do. Hands up if you knew the stem of the question, the instruction of the question, account for. If you chose that question, you knew what you were asked to do. Put your hand up if you knew how to actually account for. Daniel, what does it mean? That's exactly right. To provide reasons for the rest of the sentence, that is to say that the early Christian church had to remain underground or secretive. And you had to know that before you went in. Why you would choose a question where you didn't know how to account for something, or you didn't have the content to account for it, I don't know. But I think what you're going to find that comes through in the 4 questions and the 3 of us markers, the feedback we deliver, is that the expectation is that the content is good. Because you've seen the question, there's really no excuse for being unprepared with content. I think you would agree. There's no excuse for being unprepared with content when you've seen the question, nor is there an excuse for being unprepared for the stem of the question, the instruction being to account for or to explain or to describe or to evaluate. And I had people emailing me and say, I don't really have enough content for this question. And my question is, well, you've got 4 to choose from. Why would you choose one that you didn't have content for or you didn't feel comfortable with? So you need to be a bit more exam savvy, you need to be a bit exam smart, and that's what I'll say at the outset. And I'm pretty sure that Miss and Sir will probably say similar things in that if you've seen the question beforehand, the expectations are somewhat raised. All right? I should be able to go in and say, okay, I've got a whole page of content that I hope I see. And I can't mark you on what I don't see, I can only mark you on what I do see. However, the expectation is that certain elements of key content will be there. The structure, I've got to say, pleasingly, has improved. And this is absolutely a direct result of the work that Mr. Matheson is doing for you. All right, leading you through these literacy initiatives. The structure has clearly improved. In fact, I don't think out of about 25 scripts, I saw one response, apart from the non-attempt, the non-serious attempt, there was not one response that did not have a structured introduction, even if it was small, key points in paragraph format with a conclusion, albeit rushed in some instances, but still a conclusion. So the structure was good, and I commented on it if it was good. Okay? Peel was in action, but there's one problem, and we'll get to that, and it does have to do with content. This is why I started with content. The expansion or the elaboration on your examples was weak, and that is where you might have fallen from a top band to the next band, the 9 to 12. Okay, you might have jotted down in your intro some really spectacular key arguments, and then you basically sold it to me again in the same language, in the same way, and just paraphrased and repeated the same idea 3 or 4 times. There was a lot of repetition. I think if you look at your response and you read it again and you're questioning me about, Miss, where's the repetition, have a look at it first, have a look at your intro and just see. You use it in the same language, that's not really exploring, expanding or elaborating on your points. All right? The body is meant to be where you really show off your examples and show off your content, not just rehash the dot points that you've put in your spectacular intros. And the intros were good, but the body must expand on that. Okay? That positive praise is, or positive feedback is not applicable to all. The weaker responses, there's still this awkward expression coming through. If it doesn't make sense to you when you read it back and you stumble and you think, oh, hang on, what am I trying to say here? It's not going to make sense to us. And more importantly, next year, it will not make sense to a HSC examiner. So this awkward expression needs to be eliminated. This sort of flowery going around and round in circles, putting a few big words here and there just to try and spice it up a bit, it's not impressive if the point is not clear. All right, so in many instances, I had shorter scripts that basically just nutted out a really simple introduction with really good key content and really good points elaborated upon and linked back to the question, and it was in much simpler language, but they got 12. As opposed to some people who wrote 2.5 pages and it's beautifully written, except that some of it doesn't make sense. And there's this sort of attempt to use big words to try and make it sound elaborate, but it's really saying very little at all. So just work on your expression, work on your sentence structure, avoid repetition of ideas. If you find yourself saying the same thing over and over again, quite like you've done in the intro, just repeating it, and that's repetition, and that won't get you marks. As I started by saying, there really is no excuse for lack of content or real examples. Now, I don't have this in my slide, in my feedback, but when I'm talking about content, and I can put this up for you on Hive if you like, you would probably need to start by saying what happened when Jesus died, who picked up this idea of Christianity, and then why. Make links to the question, why did it have to remain secret? In order to answer that question, you need context. You need to know what the problem with Christianity was for both the Jewish people of the time and the Roman authorities. They're not lumped in together. Many of you had excellent content here. Okay, but you needed to really identify what were the key beliefs and practices, use of key terms, key beliefs and practices that Roman authorities and Jewish people had a problem with. Why did Christianity have to remain suppressed? Why did it have to be secretive? What was it about their beliefs and the way they practiced that aroused suspicion in the leaders of the day? All right, so some of you skirted around the idea of polytheism versus monotheism. You know, the idea that if you believe in Jesus and God, all of a sudden there's more than one, and we don't like that because we're monotheistic faith. All right, so you did need to set some context there. And as I said, there are opportunities always for greater depth of content. Even if you're sitting on a 14, the reason you probably got 14 was because I thought it just didn't nail all the content you possibly could have explored. And as I said, I can only mark what's there, not what's not there. So if you only give me three paragraphs in the body, you're limiting your opportunities to get full marks if some of this content is missing. Okay. If you got 15, and some people did, congratulations, there were a couple of 15 markers, I think maybe 2. I would still suggest room for improvement. I will give full marks if full marks is deserved. Absolutely. There's no point, there's no reason for me to rob you of a mark and then say, but it's perfect, I just don't give full marks. 15, if 15 is warranted, and two of you, I think, got that. I would still say to those people and anyone who's nearly at 15 that there are opportunities to refer to sacred text and scriptures or secondary scholars if you really want to knock the socks off your examiners. And some of you did make good and appropriate references to Matthew, which really lifts the response straight away. You know Matthew's text, and many of you had it. I guess that Sir put it up in the planning session that he did with you about the time and the timing of God's of the second coming being secret and not known and veiled in secrecy and that sort of thing. No one knows. That scripture was referred to quite appropriately, much better than sacred texts were incorporated last time round. Key terms. Don't forget when you're answering and linking back to the question, if you're using key terms like beliefs, adherence, practices, rituals, the messianic secret, parousia, these are knock your socks off terms. As soon as an examiner sees these, they know that you know your stuff and you're making links back to the question. It's very hard to fault a response that uses those terms well. Read the next point by yourselves and see if you get the tone and gist in my language. Don't do it anymore. It is such a waste of ink. It is such a waste of time. Stop rewriting the question. This is not kindy. It's unnecessary and it does waste valuable time. As Sir intimated before, if you're doing 2 unit, you're going to have to blitz that paper 3 hours writing non-stop, start to finish, and your hand should really hurt at the end, like in any 2 unit paper. Likewise with 1 unit for 90 minutes, start to finish non-stop. You don't have time to rewrite the question. Absolutely not. The examiner won't even look at it anyway. So it's just a waste of time. You've got the question there in front of you. Please stop, no more. This was only an issue for some people, timing. Exam smarts. Work around the clock, okay? It should be neatly tied up. There should be a conclusion. But structure on the whole, as I said, was done reasonably well. Again, we're not kindy. Proper nouns, capital letters. Names of emperors, names of places, names of empires. Proper nouns, capital letters. Please, it just lifts your response into that band 6 undoubted, flawless response, as opposed to this sort of kindy idea of just putting everything in lowercase and hedging your bets. Pedantic, but it's persecution, not prosecution, and about 90% of you were telling me that the Christians were prosecuted. Any questions of me? I have a whole list of content here. As I said, I didn't judge you by it. It's what I hoped to see. Many of you nailed it in terms of talking about the Council of Jerusalem AD 49, settling the debate about whether Gentiles could hear the message too, and picked up on Paul spreading that word there. The divergence, the split in beliefs around whether Jesus was coming back or whether Jesus was the Messiah. And you kind of needed to talk a little bit about what happened after Christ died. It's the early Christian church, all right, what happened in those early days. So content-wise, I'm happy to type this up and put it on Hive. Are there any questions about structure or marks, generally speaking?
And just before we get into the content of this question, the point that I meant to make earlier was that as far as marking goes in both Year 11 and 12, what you'll find is that none of us will overrule each other's marks. So if you don't like the mark that you got from a particular marker, go and speak to them. No one else is going to overrule it. We might well be able to sit down with you and suggest, other things that they might not mention in their feedback. Happy to look at it, happy to give you critiques, but you won't find marks change from anyone except the person who marked it. And the reason for that is consistency. It doesn't really matter how easy or hard someone marks, so long as it is consistent across the marking range. And that'll apply even more at the next round of exams. All right, eyes up on the screen for me. Some of the issues with this question start with the very first word. Evaluate the influence of Judaism on the formation of the early church. When we're talking about evaluate, we're talking about a Board of Studies key term where you need to make that judgment. In the very beginning of the introduction, I want you to make the judgment. A couple of you guys spoke in the last bit. Don't want you doing it again. If you can't sit next to the bloke you're next to without talking, please move. So if evaluate means make a judgment based on criteria, here's what my imagination suggests. In the introduction, you make the judgment. So if the question was evaluate if this is a hot day, in the beginning in the introduction, you'd better say, it's a hot day, or it's a cold day. Make it clear. The structure of the rest of the response then follows along the criteria you're using to make that judgment. So going back to the weather question, you might say, well, I'm going to look at the thermometer on the wall. I'm also going to look at the weather maps. I'm also going to ask 6 different people if they think it's hot. And they're going to be my 3 criteria I'm going to use to make my evaluation. That would be the structure of your body then. Your conclusion then would wrap up saying, it's a hot day. Because I asked people, because I looked at the temperature, and because I looked up the charts. So it's very repetitive and highly structured in terms of an evaluation question. Too many people didn't make that explicit statement. Judaism had a significant influence on Christianity, or Judaism had a minimal influence, or whatever the case. A really good evaluation builds momentum right through the response. And I guess that's what I was just sort of trying to suggest with the weather style question. In this question, I want to see a flow. I want to see it build. And the question doesn't say, demonstrate how it is a positive influence or a negative influence. It simply says, make a judgment whether or not it had an influence. It would be very difficult to argue that it had no influence, but anything above that you could probably argue. But you need to get that flow happening through the response. Some of the areas that people struggle with, and I guess it's a conceptual thing. We use the word worldview in the first unit, and I want you to try and apply the same concept here. I want you to pick up what's the Roman worldview at the time? What's the Jewish leaders' worldview? What are the early Christians' worldviews? And when you take on the personas of those people, you get a bit of an insight as to why they operated in the way they did. So in the case of the Romans, we're talking about a bunch of blokes who have got control of a pretty large area. Judea is an outskirt town. It's not the big part of the empire. What they're after from that area is peace. They're after control, they're after transport routes, they're after investing a minimal amount of effort to get the maximum reward. The last thing the Roman emperor wants to do is throw heaps and heaps of troops at the area. That's not in his interest, nor is it in the interest of the town. So the Roman perspective is quite unique. Same with the Jewish leaders. They've got a unique perspective. Now, the Romans kind of weren't a big fan of Christianity because it was causing grief. It was causing a bit of unrest. The Jewish leaders weren't a fan of Christianity for different reasons. And so their worldview was uniquely different insofar as they were seeing people blaspheming, they were seeing people taking the Jewish law and, ignoring it in many ways. Christ himself performing miracles on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, was unheard of. Surely curing people is work. Yet here he was on Shabbat, dealing with people who were unclean and performing work. So from that perspective, the Jewish leaders had a real thing against Christianity. Similar with the early Christians. The early Christians had a particular worldview. Some of them were Jewish, some were not. And so that differentiation between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians makes a difference to their perspective. So I guess my point here is that you need to be really careful when you're picking up a question like this where you've got to evaluate, whose perspective is it you're evaluating from? And it might be in different paragraphs you shift around, but you need to make that clear. Let's get into the detail of it then. These are some of the things that you might have mentioned. So in terms of evaluating Judaism's influence, certainly Scripture's a significant influence. If Christianity picked up half of its text from Judaism, that's a fairly significant influence. And you see that flow right through. The last point there is significant. You don't need to argue all in one direction in this case. So it's not saying argue for or argue against. It's simply make a judgment, was a contribution significant? And the answer is yes. In terms of the actual responses, structure was a problem for a lot of people. And although I could see an attempt at introduction, body, conclusion, it was particularly the sequencing of the body and working out what is your point that was the real challenge. Clearly articulating, here is the point that I'm trying to make in this paragraph, in the very first line of it, was an issue. The second part that was a significant issue across the board, and I'm talking in generalisations, was formal language versus casual language. And I suppose when you're in a formal setting and an exam situation is about as formal as it gets, you need to use a particular register. When you're out with mates, you use a different register, a different type of language. And I'd suggest to you that when you're putting the wrong language in a context, it stands out. And it's not a good standout. So think about the exam room. Things like using the numeral to instead of the word to, or using the wrong to for that matter, stands out. And it says to the marker, this guy hasn't quite got it. And if they're on the cusp of a band 5 or a band 6, gee, you won't lose marks for that particular item, but it adds to the overall effect. So where someone's on the cusp of a mark band, or a mark range, they're likely to drop down purely based on the register of the language. So I want you to be really cautious on that front. Some of the other stuff that came up in question 2, I'll pick up in question 4 as well, because I marked that one as well. We'll change to question 3, 30-second stretch. Go.
Answered out of the cohort, yet there was such a range of marks in regards to this. So the focus of the question is providing characteristics and features. You're providing characteristics and features of what Paul did in his role in it and how he established the Christian church. There was one key word as well, it's early Christian church. I don't want to know about churches today. That's great, yeah, as a result of what he did earlier on, churches today have been established. However, it's the early Christian church that you need to focus on. So a lot of you had some very strong points, but it was the elaborating and the explanation of those points that we struggled in a little bit. So providing those examples, providing quotes, supporting your points and supporting your arguments is where we struggled. Also, if you mention it in your introduction, you introduce all these different aspects of Paul, you need to speak about them. Some boys mentioned them but didn't go further on to explain them or tell me how Paul had a role in that establishment. Remember, it's 1 point per paragraph. A lot of you were speaking about the letters and the Gentiles in the same paragraphs. Don't try to confuse it. Separate them. They're 2 strong points on their own. Again, you just need to work on providing examples. So if you're including quotes, source your quotes. Where are you getting them from? Did you just make it up, or where did you get it from? Put the actual reference in. Paul went on lots of journeys and missionaries, yes, but where did he go? What did he do there? That's another thing that we failed to do. So that's the elaborating part, the explanation of those particular journeys. Yes, he wrote letters. Who did he write them to? What did he say in his letters? What were the points of his letters? Okay, you need to tell me that. A lot of you are writing with assumed knowledge of the marker. The marker assumes I know what I'm writing about. You can't go into an exam writing with that in mind. Assume nothing. Assume we know absolutely nothing. Because I get the gist of what you're trying to say, but to be more explicit, tell me. Use the key terminology. Instead of using non-Jews, use Gentiles. That's the terminology. And the areas that he travelled to as well. I wrote that there's no need for Paul's life, for his life story. We know what happened to Paul. If you're going to talk about his conversion, relate it back to the question. Tell me what that conversion of Paul and how that led to the establishment of Christianity. It's Paul, it's not Saul, and it's not St. Paul. Okay, the only time you can refer to Saul is if you're talking about his conversion, but throughout all of the writings, it's Paul. Again, there was a lot of repetition, and I think that was a common theme coming through some of the answers with the other questions as well. The boys that structured their answer really well used Peel, and it was so evident in their paragraph structure, linking it back to the question. Okay, you can't just say when you're linking though that this led to the establishment of early Christian churches. That it's not strong enough. It's not a strong enough link to the question. Tell me how it led to the establishment of the Christian churches. And the boys that went really well, had a good introduction and a conclusion. So things that you should consider that you're talking about is if you're looking at Saul, you're looking at his conversion or what he did leading up to his conversion, his background. So his educated background, he was a Roman citizen. What did that lead to? The fact he was the key player in the split of the Gentiles, or the split of the Jews from Christianity. His missionaries and his letters are things that needed to be addressed as well. Again, if you have any questions in regards to this, see me after and I can help you with any of your questions.
So compare using examples the Jewish concept of God coming to earth with the historical man, Jesus of Nazareth. I've got to say most people didn't answer this question. and for many people that was probably a good idea. This question required a level of sophistication with structure that maybe the others didn't. The two elements of this, if you like, and this is where structure gets very difficult. 2 paragraphs doesn't make an essay, yet there's really 2 parts. Part 1, you deal with what were they expecting. Part 2, you deal with what did they get in Jesus. Clearly there's significant differences between the two, but there's also similarities. And so the way that people structured this question made a significant difference to how much you wrote and how repetitious it was. And I've heard that mentioned a couple of times, that some blokes laid everything out in the very beginning, particularly in their introduction, very well, but then they just kept repeating the same thing again and again. And that happened in question 4, where people dumped all their information on page 1, and then pages 2 and 3 of their response was pretty much the same thing rehashed and didn't add anything to the conversation around it. So structuring this was significant. Ones that surprised me that worked well were where people said, here's the elements that really stood out as being common, here's the things that were kind of similar, here's the things that weren't at all common. That wasn't a structure I expected to get, yet it worked really well. The way that I would have structured it personally would have been identify one of the expectations and then compare it to Jesus, and then find another expectation and then do the comparison. So I would have taken it topic by topic or point by point, naming the point and then doing the comparison. That's the way I would have done it, but certainly the way that I just explained a moment ago worked pretty well as well. The key element here is that the Jews were expecting this heavenly king-style character coming on a Roman chariot almost, with spear in hand as a warrior and shield, ready to smite anyone who was against them. Anyone who wasn't Jewish was absolutely going to get obliterated as he threw lightning bolts. That was the kind of mental image, and people had scripture references to back that up. The man Jesus of Nazareth was quite different to that. We talk about the expectation of the Messiah having a kingly background, and a lot of people mention the King David heritage. Interestingly enough, a lot of people then went on to say, but he wasn't from King David's line because he was born of a virgin mother. So Joseph's line doesn't count. The question you need to ask yourself is, are you applying a Christian worldview to a Jewish question? Are you applying a Christian worldview to a Jewish question? Judaism wouldn't see Mary as being, having an immaculate conception. They would have seen Mary, Joseph, husband and wife, newly husband and wife, new baby. Makes sense. Nothing special. They then went and had the child in basically a stable. It would have been in some sort of underground cavern almost. And the idea and the way that it worked at the time wasn't so much that it was a building as a stable, more likely it would have been a cave. More likely, the upper room that they talk about in the scriptures would have been a cave with a slight platform above it. And the reason that you'd go in there is that all the animals inside there would have created body heat, which would have made you warmer. So there was really logical sense as to why he was born in a stable. Yet the Christian ideas that you started to apply simply don't follow through to the Jewish tradition. So just, I guess, a word of warning. When you're expressing yourself, you need to be quite objective. You need to stand back from the scenario, and the marker shouldn't be able to tell your personal religious tradition. They shouldn't be able to take a guess to work out what faith you are personally. Stronger references, as it mentions there, utilised really strong quality quotes. Obviously those ones were rote-learnt for this exam. When we arrive at the HSC, you need to be in the same position, except that you're learning quotes. In the case of 2 unit, you're learning it from St Paul. You're also learning it from a 12th century Jewish scholar. You're also learning it from an Islamic scholar. And you need to have an equal number of quotes for all 3 of those. Multiply that out then not only by person, but also do it with practice and ethics, which are the 3 areas we cover. You've got 9 banks of quotes effectively you've got to be able to walk into the exam room with. It's a fair bit of learning, and if you're not yet in that habit, you need to get into it. Again, I've mentioned structure already. The development of points and clarity in naming that point at the very beginning of the paragraph was a real challenge for many. So clearly articulating what is the point that I'm trying to make is going to make your life easier, and it's going to make your marker's life easier. And I think it was mentioned in question 1 that some people scored far better, even though their language and their sophistication wasn't as high, purely because of clarity. So clarity is king on this stuff. And I've mentioned the be aware of applying Christian teachings. So overall, what we're seeing here in terms of total academic results are an average below where I'd like it to be. We're talking averages in the 60s. I want the average no less than 75. I'm not going to change the marking level. You've got to change the quality of responses. Those guys who are scoring less than 30, we need to have a conversation. Those guys who received non-serious attempt written on any of their scripts, you need to see me urgently. And for those blokes in particular, I would expect to see a blue form filled in, if not tomorrow, the next day. Otherwise, I've got to start sending out HSC warning letters. Right, you don't want those landing on your record, so I'll give you that time. Get the paperwork done now. Your classes won't actually change for another week or so, at least, because Mr. Sullivan has to wait until reports are completed. So you'll be reported on based on these marks. The same will then apply at the yearly exams, rather. If you've got